Glad that you are all here today, and if you have not caught on to the routine, you will need a bulletin because the outline of the sermon is in the bulletin. And if you don't want the whole bulletin, I think there's some separate just outlines, but it's helpful to have that. That way you know where the scriptures are, and you can fill in all the blanks, and your dad will buy you an ice cream cone if you do. So make sure you get all those filled in. More important, have a Bible available, and you can turn to 2 Kings chapter 17. And that's where we will be talking about fearing the lions. Fearing the lions. You're probably looking at that thinking, what in the world is this all about? Fearing the lions. You know, if we really understood what was true, we would fear nothing but God. But Satan has done a great job of confusing things. He has substitutes. Let me show you what I mean by that. You know there are angels, right? Well, 2 Corinthians chapter 11 verse 14 says that Satan can disguise himself as an angel of light. There is Christ, but Satan also has the Antichrist. Many Antichrists, according to 1 John chapter 2 and verse 18. There's the church of Christ. Satan substitutes that with imitation Christianity. There is the gospel. Satan substitutes that with another gospel, which Galatians chapter 1 verse 8 says is really not another gospel. There is godly sorrow in 2 Corinthians chapter 7. Satan substitutes that with guilted regret. That same passage, 2 Corinthians 7, says godly sorrow leads to no regret. There is faith. Satan substitutes that with credulity. There's the joy of the Holy Spirit in 1 Thessalonians chapter 1, verse 6. Satan substitutes that with fleeting pleasures. There is the fear of the Lord. Satan substitutes that with the fear of consequences. There is salvation. And Satan substitutes that with false doctrine, which leads to false security, so people feel like they are saved. And they're really not. For everything that Christianity offers, Satan has a substitute. It's no wonder people are so confused. Before we get to the text in 2 Kings, I want to talk about something that happened in 1 Kings chapter 12. You don't need to turn there, but just so you're aware of it. When Solomon was about to die, he appointed Rehoboam, his son, to be the next king. But Rehoboam didn't handle things right. He didn't listen to the advice of the elders who told him, go easy on the people and they'll love you. No, he listened to the young men. As a result, the 10 northern tribes rebelled against Rehoboam. They started their own kingdom. They called that Israel. The 2 southern tribes were called Judah. The 10 northern tribes appointed their own king, Jeroboam, not Rehoboam, Jeroboam. I know that's confusing. Jeroboam cared more about keeping his throne than he did about pleasing God. And he knew if the people kept going down to Jerusalem to worship that he would lose his people. And so he set up two false places to worship. One in Dan and one in Bethel. And put there, of all things, golden calves. You'd think they would have learned their lesson before. But no, he builds golden calves. And that's where they worshiped. And that brought in idolatry into the 10 northern tribes. And then the next king left them there. And the next king left them. And the next king left them. Until we get to Hosea. And Hosea did evil. And God withdrew his protection from Israel as a result that they fell to the Assyrians. Now we're going to read a lot, and so I hope that you will follow along. 2 Kings chapter 17 and verse 1 says, in the 12th year of Ahaz, the king of Judah, Hoshea, the son of Elah, became king over Israel. This would have been about 731 BC. He became king over Israel and Samaria, and he reigned 9 years. He did evil in the sight of the Lord, only not as the kings of Israel who were before him. Shalmaneser, king of Assyria, came up against him, and Hoshea became his servant and paid him tribute. But the king of Assyria found conspiracy in Hoshea, who had sent messengers to So, king of Egypt, and offered no tribute to the king of Assyria, as he had done year by year. So the king of Assyria shut him up and bound him in prison. Then the king of Assyria invaded the whole land and went to Samaria and besieged it 3 years. In the 9th year of Hoshea, the king of Assyria captured Samaria, and he carried Israel away into exile to Assyria and settled them in Hala and Habor on the river of Gozan in the cities of the Medes. So Hoshea became king in 731 BC, so this would have been 722 BC. The Assyrians came and conquered the 10 northern tribes, carried them away into Assyria, dispersed them. They were never reassembled. So we're reading this event in history. Now what's interesting is God got blamed for this. They said, God, how come you gave up? How come you abandoned your people? But it wasn't God's fault. It was the sins of the sons of Israel. And we're going to read another very long section. And by the way, the reason I do this is we don't read the Old Testament near enough. And I want you to see it in your own Bible. I think you will get more out of the lesson if you do that. The very next verse explains what the problem is. Verse 7. Now this came about because the sons of Israel had sinned against the Lord their God, who had brought them up from the land of Egypt, from under the hand of Pharaoh, king of Egypt. And they had feared other gods, and walked in the customs of the nations, whom the Lord had driven out before the sons of Israel, and in the customs of the kings of Israel, which they had introduced. Verse 9, the sons of Israel did things secretly, which were not right against the Lord their God. Moreover, they built for themselves high places in all their towns, from watchtowers to fortified cities. They set for themselves sacred pillars and Asherim on every high hill, under every green tree. And they burned incense on all the high places, as the nations did which the Lord had carried away to exile before them. And they did evil things, provoking the Lord. They served idols, concerning which the Lord said to them, you shall not do this thing. Yet the Lord warned Israel and Judah through all his prophets and every seer, saying, turn from your evil ways and keep my commandments, my statutes, according to all that the law which I commanded your fathers, and which I sent to you through my servants the prophets. However, they did not listen, but stiffened their neck, like their fathers, who did not believe in the Lord their God. They rejected his statutes and his covenants, which he had made with their fathers, and his warnings, with which he had warned them. And they followed vanity and became vain, and went after the nations which surrounded them, concerning which the Lord had commanded them not to do like them. They forsook all the commandments of the Lord their God, and made for themselves molten images, even 2 calves, and made an Asherah, and worshipped all the host of heaven, and served Baal. Then they made their sons and their daughters pass through the fire, and practiced divination and enchantments, and sold themselves to do evil in the sight of the Lord, provoking him. So the Lord was very angry with Israel, and removed them from his sight. None was left except the tribe of Judah. It was not God's fault that this happened. God had a covenant relationship with them, and God kept his part of the covenant. They violated their side of the covenant. And as a result, God had to withdraw his protection. He kept his promise. You know, anytime I preach from the Old Testament, I know a lot of people think, well, why are we studying this? Really? I mean, we live under the new covenant. And besides, this is all about idolatry. We're not Hindus. We're not Buddhists. We don't bow down and worship images. We live in America. You know what? America is the most idolatrous nation on earth. Because an idol is anything that you place above God. When you take something and you put it up there, that is an idol. When you think about it that way, we even have a show called American Idol. I mean, think about it. We are idolatrous. We are an idolatrous nation. And, you know, it was not so much what they did openly that made God angry. It was their secret sins. What they secretly incurred. Verse 9 talks about that. What they did secretly. And we have the same problem in our nation. It's the secret things that go on. Let me preface what I'm going to share with you by telling you a true story. I have 3 young men that I played disc golf with, all of them members of the church, all of them either ministers or training to be ministers, wonderful young men, 2 brothers and a brother-in-law. And we were playing in a tournament this last year together, and one of them had a birthday coming up. And so the brother-in-law bought tickets to the Thunder game because this young man really likes the Thunder. Wanted to go to the Oklahoma Thunder. They go to the game, get to the ticket booth, and find out they've been scammed on the tickets. $400. And these young guys can't afford $400. I thought about that. Somebody sinned against those young men secretly. There's a lot that goes on, especially with internet. There's a lot of secret sins. And I'm talking about more than pornography. I'll preach on that sometime. By the way, do you want to know the way to preach the best sermon you've ever preached in your life? I know this from experience. I've done it. Preach an entire sermon on pornography. I did this. I don't mean a little bit. I mean the whole sermon was on pornography. Everybody walked out and nobody said a word. The next week, they said, that's the best sermon you've ever preached. The next sermon was the best one, not the one on pornography. It's like, oh boy, this is a great sermon. That's how you preach the best sermon. Lots of things go on the internet. Scamming. This is not in your notes, but I've been studying a lot in the Proverbs. Let me just share. I mean, you can follow along if you want. I'll be in Proverbs chapter 14. Just listen to a lot of these things. We don't think about what we do with our money. There's a lot of sins that are associated with finances. And in Proverbs chapter 14, just listen to this. 14 verse 31 says, he who oppresses the poor taunts his maker. He who is gracious to the needy honors him. Chapter 15 verse 27 says, he who profits illicitly troubles his house, his own house. But he who hates a bribe will live. Chapter 16, verse 11, a just balance and scales belong to the Lord. All the weights of the bag are his concern. Back in those days, a merchant would have scales, but when he was buying something from you, he would use the heavy scales. And you need to put a little more on there, and a little more. But then when he'd go to sell it, he'd use his lighter scales to sell with. It was wrong. He also mentioned this in chapter 20 and verse 10. Differing weights and differing measures, both of them are abominable to the Lord. Look at chapter 22 and verse 16. He who oppresses the poor to make more for himself, or who gives to the rich, will only come to poverty. We don't think about these types of sins, and especially if they're scamming, they're swindling that goes on. And I thought about my 3 friends. What if the person who did that to them was actually a Christian? Wouldn't it be awful? And people would say, well, you know, if they were dumb enough to buy the tickets, people justify those types of things in their minds, but it's wrong. Folks, that's why gambling is wrong. Here's one that a lot of people don't understand. Gambling is wrong, not because it's a risk. That's foolish to think. We take risk all the time. It's because if you happen to win, if you get lucky enough to win, you're taking money away from somebody else. You're taking food off somebody's table. And it's not hurting the casinos. Casinos are set up mathematically. They can't lose. You're winning at somebody else's loss. And all those scriptures I just shared with you in Proverbs say, don't do that. Anytime we earn money to the detriment of somebody else, it's wrong. If it's not win-win, we should not do it. Are you hearing me? It is wrong. It's sinful to do that. We don't even think about that. A lot of times we think, well, if he's dumb enough to buy it, or if they're dumb enough to go spend it at the casino, that's their fault. No, it's wrong to do so. Secret sins, the things that go on in our heads, God knows our minds. That's what got the Israelites in trouble, was their secret sins. That's why God said, I'm withdrawing from you, not just your outward sins, but your secret sins, the things that go on the inside. Don't just clean the outside of the dish, clean the inside of the dish as well. Next, Samaria, man, what's going on? I got a new clicker, by the way. There it is. Samaria was repopulated with unbelievers. Going back to 2 Kings chapter 17. This is something that was never explained to me when I was a young Christian. I couldn't figure out why the Jews hated the Samaritans. Because the Samaritans, I thought that was the 10 northern tribes that had been brought back. No, it wasn't. These were foreigners. Look what happened in 2 Kings chapter 17 and verse 24. It says, the king of Assyria, now this would be King Sargon II. The king of Assyria brought men from Babylon and from Cutha and from Ava and from Hamath and from Sepharvaim and settled them in the cities of Samaria, in places of the sons of Israel. So they possessed Samaria and lived in its cities. At the beginning of their living there, they did not fear the Lord. Therefore, the Lord sent lions among them, which killed some of them. So it was people from all over the other nations that came into Samaria, and then they intermarried with some of the Israelites, which the Israelites were not supposed to do. And that's why there was such a strong hatred between the Samaritans and the Jews who were living in Judah, in Jerusalem. But these people didn't belong there. They were not the people that God said, this is who the promised land is for. We see next, number 4, these outsiders wanted them to learn about God, but not because they feared God, it was because they feared the lions. Lions is what goes in your blank, by the way. Notice they feared the lions, and so they want to know, what do we need to do to take care of the lions? Read on with me in verse 26. So they spoke to the king of Assyria, saying, the nations whom you have carried away into exile in the cities of Samaria do not know the custom of the God of the land. They're referring to Jehovah God as the God. That bugs me. Little g, the God of the land. So he sent lions among them, and behold, they kill them because they do not know the custom of the God of the land. And then the king of Assyria commanded, saying, take there one of the priests whom you carried away into the exile, and let him go to live there, and let him teach the custom of the God of the land. So one of the priests whom they had carried away into exile from Samaria came and lived at Bethel, and taught them how they should fear the Lord. But every nation still made gods of its own, and put them in the houses of the high places which the people of Samaria had made, every nation in their cities in which they lived. So here are these outsiders, and they get attacked and eaten by lions. They say, oh, well, it's because we don't understand the God of this land. We need to get to know the God of this land. But it wasn't that they feared God, they feared the lions. You see the difference? The problem is they feared the lions. Just like some people come to God today, not because they want to worship God, it's because they're afraid of something else. They're afraid of going to hell. They're afraid of making God angry. They're afraid of what others might think. And so here really is the problem. If you fear the lions, then staying away from the lions becomes more important to you than pleasing God. That's the problem. They feared the lions, and so they came to learn about God. That was wonderful. You know, I know for a fact some people come to church because they're afraid of going to hell. That's not the reason to keep coming to church, but hey, if that gets you coming, hey, I went to church the first time to meet girls. Serious, I was a college kid, and that's why I went. That's all I cared about, right? Why you come the first time doesn't matter. But you keep coming should be because of your love for God and because you want to please Him. But if you keep coming because you fear the lions, then it's not as important to you that you please God. That's the problem. We fear things. We fear disease. I don't want to make that point yet. We fear disease. We fear weather. Some people don't come because, oh, well, the weather might be bad, you know, and we might get trapped by a storm or this or that. We fear persecution. You know, if we fear the storms, then we don't assemble. If we fear persecution, then we don't openly practice our Christianity. We're afraid of what others will say. Fear stifles us. I'm going to talk a little bit about COVID. We went all through that experience, and I'm a networker. I talk to ministers and elders all across Oklahoma, Colorado, California, Kansas, Louisiana, Georgia, Virginia, Ohio. I know a lot of people in a lot of different places. And I can tell you, it was not a fun time to be an elder. COVID was hard time, because almost anything you did wasn't right. We tried this, we tried that. It was so hard to figure out the right thing to do. The Wuhan virus is actually what it was initially called because it started in Wuhan, China in 2019. And the reason it's called COVID-19 is because it started in 2019, not that it's the 19th strain of COVID. A lot of people don't realize that. COVID-19 was in 2019. Folks, it's 2025. And COVID's still here. I don't know what to tell you. I don't think it's going away. It's kind of like influenza. Influenza was a horrible pandemic that swept across the world during World War I. More people died from influenza than died in the war. 1/5 of the world's population got sick from influenza. Do you know when that was? 1918. That was over 100 years ago. Guess what? We still have influenza today. We just call it the flu. But it's still here today. These things paralyze us. They keep us from practicing our faith. And I'm going to sound, I'm sure, like a monster, but if we can make it to the store and to the restaurants and to the ball games and to other shopping and other social events, why can't we make it to church? I understand we have shut-ins. We had shut-ins before COVID, didn't we? I understand we have people who legitimately cannot make it. I get that. So don't misread me. But I care about people's souls. And I can't imagine standing before God and explaining, well, God, I didn't go to church, but I did go, yeah, I went to the restaurant, you know, and I went to all these places. I can't imagine standing before God and trying to explain that. You do realize that first century Christians went at the risk of their lives to assemble for church. I mean, every time. They went at the risk of their lives to assemble together as Christians. We read about that. I talked about it when I was preaching on Revelation last week. And a couple of weeks ago, I talked about Hebrews 12, where they were sawn in two. You know, they were captured. They were beaten. They were threatened. They still assembled together. They shared their faith at the risk of their lives. They went out in the community, invited people to come to church. invited people to hear the gospel. They did so at the risk of their lives. Fear cripples us. And so, if you're here today because you fear the lions, your conversion is false and your religion is pointless. I know that sounds harsh, but I'm just telling you straight. You've missed the whole point of what it means to be a Christian. You don't understand if it's fear of the lions. And one more point I'm going to make about this one before we move on. If you fear the lions, if you fear false gods, then you do not fear the Lord. And it's not that you can't fear two things. You can fear two things. You can fear three things. I know people that fear everything. They just live in fear. But you cannot fear God and fear something else. If you fear God, that drives out, 1 John chapter 4, verse 18 says, perfect love drives out fear. If I fear God, I have nothing else to be afraid of, do I? Don't fear the lions. That's the point. The priests who were appointed by Jeroboam were not even from the Levitical priests. So they send to the king of Assyria, and he says, well, send one of the priests that you've taken into captivity. But they weren't even Levites. They're the 10 northern tribes. They're not even Levites. They're not even supposed to be priests. So they're sending false priests. We won't read it. I'll just put this scripture up here. But this is the one I was talking about earlier, 1 Kings chapter 12, where the king appointed these high places in Bethel and Dan. Dan is way up in the north, is far, far away from Jerusalem, but Bethel's only 10 miles away from Jerusalem. I'm thinking, man, if you're going to walk to Bethel to worship a pagan god, you just will go on down to Jerusalem and worship the real God. But they did this. Look at verse 30. Now this thing became a sin for the people, and they went to worship before one as far as Dan. And he made houses, he meaning the king, not God. He made houses on high places and made priests from among all the people who are not of the sons of Levi. He did. Man-made. It was man-made religion. It was man-made church leaders, just like we have today. If you're worshiping today and your worship was established by people, in other words, it's not in the Word of God, the way you worship, and the structure of the church is not here, it's pointless. It's worthless. They appointed these leaders. The king did. And it gets worse. The next thing they did was they appointed their own priest, who were not even Israelites. The first ones were at least Israelites. Now these guys weren't even Israelites. Back to our text here, verse 31. And the Avites made Nibhaz and Tartak, those are pagan gods, and the Sepharvites burned their children in the fire to Andromelech and Anamelech, the gods of Sepharvaim. They also feared the Lord and appointed from among themselves priests to the high places who acted for them in the houses of the high places. The problem with fearing others, if Satan can get you to fear other things besides God, he can get you to do evil things, like feed your children into the fire, which I can't even fathom that. But that's what fear does. Fear leads us the wrong direction. I'm going to back up and I'm going to read verse 32 again, but here's the point I want to make. No repentance. There's no remorse. The end result is going right back into the same old sins. I'll show you why I'm doing this, but look again. Let's read verse 32 again. So they also feared the Lord and appointed from among themselves priests of the high places who acted for them in the house of the high places. And they feared the Lord and served their own gods according to the custom of the nations from among whom they had been carried away into exile. To this day, they do according to their earlier customs. They do not fear the Lord, nor do they follow their statutes or their ordinances or the laws or the commandments which the Lord commanded the sons of Jacob, whom he named Israel, with whom the Lord made a covenant and commanded them, saying, You shall not fear other gods, nor bow down yourselves to them, nor serve them, nor sacrifice to them. Now I'll show you why I wanted to read verse 32 again. If you have a highlighter, in verse 32, highlight feared the Lord. And then in verse 33, highlight feared the Lord, served their own gods. And then in verse 34, highlight they do not fear the Lord. And then stand back and look at that whole thing, and you'll see the digression. What happened? At first, they feared the Lord. In the next verse, they feared the Lord and served their other gods. In the end, they didn't fear the Lord. You see what I'm saying? If you fear other things, you really don't fear the Lord. I'm telling you, Satan has done his job well. He knows how to pull us off track. You know, if you're sitting here this morning, in this assembly, and you're thinking, I'm doing this. I'm letting fear control me, and I'm not fearing God. I'm fearing other things. Well, then I have some advice. Leave your idols, be truly converted, and learn to love God. Verse 37. The statutes and the ordinances and the law and the commandment which he wrote for you, you shall observe to do forever. And you shall not fear other gods. The covenant that I made with you, you shall not forget, nor shall you fear other gods. He says it again. But the Lord, your God, you shall fear, and he will deliver you from the hand of all your enemies. However, they did not listen, but they did according to their earlier custom. So while these nations feared the Lord, they also served their idols, their children likewise, and their grandchildren as their fathers did. So they do to this day. It was tragic for the Israelites. Those 10 northern tribes were dispersed. They were never reassembled. They never came back. It was a very unhappy ending for them, but it does not have to be an unhappy ending for you. Because this morning, if you're not where you need to be with God, you can change that. Stop letting fear control your life. Fear is a good short-range motivator. We use it with our kids as parents, right? Sometimes a little fear gets them moving in the right direction. But fear doesn't keep us going in the right direction. If fear doesn't transition to love, then it doesn't keep us going. I did a lot of things because I feared my dad. It kept me out of a lot of trouble. But when Dad wasn't around, or if I thought for some reason he wouldn't find out, that didn't keep me going. It was love. My love for my parents that eventually won out. And that's what sustains you. Same thing is true in your relationship with God. Fear will get you going in the right direction, and that's fine. But if you don't transition that to love and really learn how to love God, it won't sustain you. So where are you at this morning? As we're singing this song of invitation, which we do every time we have a sermon, I want you to think about just where you're at right now in your walk with God. And what it is that you fear. Don't make the mistake that these Israelites made. So afraid of the danger that's out there that you don't see the blessing that's out there and seek the blessing. If you need to respond in some way, please come as we stand and sing. Hello, I'm Curtis Hartshorn, minister at the Lake Road Church of Christ in Gore, Oklahoma. So glad that you took the time to hear this message from God's Word, and really pray it will enrich your faith. Now, if there's anything we can do for you, if you have any questions about the Bible or the Lord's Church,
Feel free to email me at the address at the bottom of the screen, or stop by and visit anytime, 2080 North Main Street in Gore, Oklahoma. May God richly bless you as you strive to know Him more deeply.